today I want to talk a bit about the complexity of young people's careers aspirations. And to do this, I'm going to draw on 4 data sets, 4 studies that I've been involved with over the past few years. I'm going to draw on the qualitative aspects mainly of all of these. The first is the social class and higher education study. This was some work we did trying to look at the reasons why young people from working class backgrounds and minority ethnic backgrounds don't go to university. So there's 118 of them that we interviewed. The second one is what I'm calling the urban youth and schooling study. And this was looking at what we might call young people in London who were defined by their schools as at risk of not progressing into post-16 education, aged 14 to 17. We tracked them over a couple of years. The third one is the British Chinese Pupils Study. This is something I did with Becky Francis of the Royal Society of Arts. And we were looking at the reasons for the British Chinese pupils' success in UK schools. So again, we looked at 14 to 16-year-olds and we interviewed the parents, pupils and children. Parents, teachers and children. And the last study is the Aspires study, which is an ongoing 5-year longitudinal study funded by the ESRC, in which we're looking at the ways in which young people aged 10 to 14 formulate their ideas about their careers and particularly their science aspirations. And that involves both a survey of over 9,000 pupils in England and also interviews with 187 parents and pupils. And we're going to be tracking them over the 5 years. So we'll be re-interviewing them when they're in years 8 and 9. So I'm going to try and argue today that race, ethnicity, social class and gender are all very important in not only shaping the nature and the direction of young people's aspirations, but also the processes through which these aspirations are formed. And I'm going to do it by looking at 3 key themes. So I'm going to talk about the role of knowledge and cultural capital, then identity and cultural discourses, and finally structural factors and what we call horizons of possibility. So in terms of the first of these, knowledge and cultural capital, I'm using a notion of cultural capital here derived from the work of the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. And this is referring to the knowledge and the cultural resources that people possess. So it can exist in various forms. There are obviously the sort of standardised forms, the notion of educational qualifications, for example, and credentials. There's also the form of cultural capital as notions of cultural knowledge and taste. And finally, there's also cultural capital can be the kind of tacit, taken for granted cultural knowledge that people have of the social world and social systems. It refers to their ability to operate within social fields in ways that enable them to know the rules of the game. And of course, Bourdieu argues that the middle classes in particular tend to possess more dominant forms of cultural and social capital. And as a result, they're able to operate more naturally and more strategically within social fields such as education and employment. And indeed, Bourdieu argues that it's the synchronicity between middle-class values and knowledges and social fields such as education that means that they can move, as he puts it, like a fish in water. It's much more natural, it's not as difficult, it doesn't need as much calculation in that sense. Now, undoubtedly, across all of the studies that I've mentioned, many of the young people and their families were disadvantaged by what we might call a lack of cultural capital, a lack of kind of knowledge of the system. They rarely had a sense, particularly in the urban youth and schooling and the access to higher education studies, they rarely had a sense of which educational subject choices and routes would best help them to realise their career aspirations. They also, in particular, had very little idea about what higher education is, how you get there, how much it costs, what it entails. Similarly, in the Aspire study, the Science Aspirations study, we found that those children who came from families who lacked what we called a scientific habitus, the sense of families which are very knowledgeable with, familiar with, engaged with aspects of science, scientifically literate, you might say. Unsurprisingly, they were from predominantly working class families. And this lack of scientific, cultural and social capital meant that their perceptions of careers from science were dominated by quite stereotypical and narrow views of what science might be, what it is, where it might take you. Now, much of the government education policy tends to assume that the possession of information is central to individual decision-making, It's kind of based on a model that we gather the information, we calculate it, and we make quite rational, calculated choices about what we want to do. And as I'm sure you're aware, lots of initiatives are kind of based around this model. They're an information provision model. The idea is if we just give people more and better information about whether it's particular careers or higher education, then they can make better choices. But I'm going to suggest that it's not actually a lack of cultural capital per se. I mean, it's important, but it's not the only element of the process. And that there are particularly inequalities in the ways in which young people and their families tend to access and interpret information. And I'm going to suggest that a purely information-based provision model is actually going to be quite limited in its success, or more particularly, it can be quite socially divisive. It can feed into social inequalities. So my first contention is that aspirations, as shown in the various research studies, tend to be multiple, they can often be contradictory, and there's frequently no single moment of decision. There's no actual discrete point in time in which most people sit down, collect all the information, assess it, and make this sort of finite and enduring decision. And as various studies have shown, for example, there are social differences in this. So for the middle classes, often higher education and university is something that's always been known. It's almost not needed to be articulated frequently within families. And the work of Diane Ray and her colleagues underline that quite strongly. Whereas for the working classes, it can be a much more difficult choice, although some of the work we've conducted has shown, actually for many working class young people, it's a non-decision. It's something that's simply never entered into their horizons of choice in any meaningful way. Secondly, I would suggest that aspirations tend not to always be these rational calculations of risk, cost and benefit, although sometimes some decisions in some parts of the middle classes may resemble this model more. It's not so prevalent, I'd say, among working class groups in this sort of calculated way. Cultural and identity discourses, as I'm going to suggest shortly, are also important, and the metaphor of landscapes of choice has been proposed by Sharon Gewertz and colleagues as a better way of capturing this sort of amorphous process through which aspirations are formed. And finally, I'm going to suggest that information isn't neutral. It's obviously presented from particular perspectives, and it's taken up and interpreted in different ways by different audiences. So the work of Stephen Ball and Carol Vincent has been particularly useful, I think, in showing the ways in which different class groups and families can make use of educational information in different ways. And they distinguish between hot and cold knowledge. So they suggest that cold knowledge is sort of the official forms of knowledge, so brochures, prospectuses, so on. And they suggest that middle class families tend to be much more adept and strategic at using this sort of information. In contrast, working class families tend to privilege or place a bit more weight and emphasis on what they call hot knowledge, which is interpersonal grapevine knowledge. And certainly in our work, we found this to be the case. So, for example, young people we talked to were more likely to base their aspirations and their ideas and their choices on information they've got from family and friends, trusted sources, but also word of mouth. For example, in the higher education and social class study, one Black Caribbean young woman who's 16-year-old called Carmel said that she basically chose her further education college on the basis of what she heard some people talking about at a bus stop. Because she said, well, they've got no axe to grind. I just overheard them, they weren't talking to me, so obviously it was impartial and worth listening to, and she went to that college. Interestingly, though, we also found that some of the middle-class pupils in the British Chinese study actually made very little use of cold information as well. And as I'll go on to talk about a bit later, the family was a much more important source of aspirations in that sense.